Well, welcome to the Journal of Marketing webinar series. My name is Christine Mormon. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Marketing, and I'm joined by my good friend, John Lynch, who is the executive director of the Marketing Science Institute. JM and MSI are co-sponsoring this important webinar. And as many of you know, the Journal of Marketing and MSI have a long history of developing and disseminating new marketing knowledge together. Our missions are very well aligned, as you can see. We're both really focused on the importance of linking marketing scholarship to industry and to the real world of marketing. And the focus of this webinar is on GMO labeling. And we think this is a really important topic that will appeal to policymakers, many of whom are attending today, managers, and also researchers. And as the Journal of Marketing paper that we published on this topic shows, and as our speakers will discuss, the science and anti-science issues embedded in this topic are very complex, and they involve consumers, companies, as well as the functioning of markets. So thank you for joining us for this discussion as US policymakers move to make important decisions on this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to John to set the stage for this session.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. Well, we are so excited about this, this session and this paper. We think it's a very important paper. And kind of the setup for this is a paper about the consequences of the regulatory labeling regime for GM foods. We in the Marketing Science Institute are quite interested in this issue in the broader set of topics that relate to consumers' ideologies, how consumers' ideologies affect their behavior in the marketplace, and then how firms have to navigate this. As this slide shows results from a 2014 study that was done of scientists in the American Association for the Advancement of Science and another representative sample of US consumers, all this done by Pew Research. And they reviewed these issues where the scientists and the non-scientists disagreed or had different views. And you see on the left panel there that safe to eat genetically modified foods, that the scientists overwhelmingly believe that they are safe to eat, whereas most US adults did not believe that. And you notice the scientific consensus is not perfect, but it's at the same level as on the right panel, where we look at the scientific consensus that climate change is mostly caused by human activities. So there's a number of these issues that our MSI member firms are navigating, where there are these quote anti-science attitudes, and it could be GM foods, it could be things related to climate, it could be things related to vaccines. Now here, it's very interesting from a regulatory standpoint, because what the anti-GMO activists say is, I deserve to know what's in the food that I'm eating, which sounds very, very reasonable. But on the right-hand side, this is an editorial from 2013 in Scientific American, where the editors said, labels for GMO foods are a bad idea, and they give their reasoning for why that's the case. We'll hear more about that. The scientific drum beating got louder as we went on in that same decade. And so this is when 107 Nobel Prize winners wrote this letter to Greenpeace, asking them to call off their campaign to try to resist GMO foods. And they say, the scientific and regulatory agencies around the world have repeatedly and consistently found that crops and foods improved through biotechnology to be just as safe, if not safer, than those derived from other methods. There's never been a single case of a confirmed negative health outcome for humans or animals, and the environmental impacts are repeatedly shown to be less damaging than other modes of agriculture, and improves biodiversity. So that's what they say. Okay, now if we shift to this, on the other hand, in different parts of the world, GM foods are labeled or regulated in different ways. And so if the scientists are concluding that the GM foods are, from a physical standpoint, not different in safety from the non-GM foods, then is it just another source of differentiation that if you decide, it's like religion, if you decide that you want to buy things that are kosher labeled, you buy things that are kosher labeled. Is it a matter of taste like any other taste attribute? And how should regulators consider the regulation of the labeling of aspects of foods that are not a matter of safety, but rather it's a matter of personal taste? And so in this paper, we're going to hear about presence focused, where you're required to say that you have GMOs if that's the case, versus absent focus if you want to say, well, we don't have GMOs. And one of the things we have going on in this, we have some really interesting panel after hearing the paper. So we have Sabrina Roberts, who's the head of UK genetically modified and genome editing policy to give us kind of a regulator's perspective. And we have actually, she's part of a terrific panel. So we're going to start with this paper by Neeraj Arora. And following that, we have a panel where Sydney Scott and Sabrina Roberts are going to talk about the consumer side of how consumers react to these kinds of labels. And then we're going to hear from Sarah Moshari on the academic side and Maha Tahiri from the industry side about how firms are likely to respond to changes in labeling regulation. So we're very, very happy to have Neeraj with us to present this important paper.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. This is a great opportunity for us to share our research that recently got accepted Journal of Marketing. This is joint work with Youngju Kim and Sanha Kim, and I'm presenting this work on the team's behalf. As John just mentioned, there's this tension between what consumers think and then what scientists say. There's this nervousness in the part of consumers to consume GMO products because they're worried about some health concerns, but it's also well known in the literature that consumers have pretty low knowledge about that. So against this backdrop of incongruent kind of thoughts, this presents a challenge for policymakers. And when you look across the globe, there's large variation in policies that are being adopted for GMO labeling. On the left-hand side, you see voluntary labeling, which firms that have non-GM products just display a label like what you see on the top left-hand side. If you're in the US, you've seen that fairly regularly in grocery stores. But then you have the other extreme where you have mandatory labeling, right? And an example of that is in Brazil, which you have this yellow triangle with transgenicos on it, which is serves as a warning label. And in the US more recently, the bioengineered label that you see on the bottom left corner, is in the process of being adopted right now. So against this backdrop, what's really interesting is how do we think about voluntary versus mandatory labeling? And if you think about a non-GMO kind of a label, that's what we call a absence-focused labeling. And then in mandatory labels are more focused on the presence of the GMO. And then they're quite different in what's being focused on. And there's certainly negative signaling that goes with a GMO label. So what starts off as an intent on the part of policymakers to inform consumers, because consumers want to know. Thank you. I can see my next slide now. So what happens is an intent to inform consumers and then kind of create this horizontal differentiation. So there's people who want a non-GMO product can buy non-GMO, and GMO people can buy GMO products. But there's a spillover effect, an externality of this policy, which is to actually start moving people away from genetically modified foods to non-GMO foods. This is a kind of a strong lever, if you will, on the part of policymakers. The intent is for information, but what actually ends up happening is it shifts demand towards non-GMO products. Whether that's a good thing or not, we think there's some significant societal costs to that, and we investigate that. The other related aspects we investigate is things like pricing and how consumers evaluate pricing. And across 4 studies, I would look at issues pertaining to the impact of GMO labels on consumer behavior. So as we show in our first study, which is on the next slide, we look at a category like pickles, and then as you can imagine, we create 4 conditions here. There's a baseline condition where there's no labeling. And then there's a voluntary labeling condition where you see this non-GMO label. And then the third condition is mandatory labeling, where the only label that exists is the GMO, a warning label, if you will. And then the last condition is the presence of both the yellow GMO label and then the non-GMO, like a full disclosure. So every product in the category is shown some kind of a label. The impact of these labels on demand is significant. So what we find is in the no label condition, when we were to focus only on the GM products, which is Clausen and Vlasic in our case, their share, collective share is 77.1%. But in the presence of a voluntary label, that declines to 70.7%. In the presence of a mandatory yellow label, that declines even further to 57.9%. And the decline is even more when both GMO and non-GMO labels are present. So basically, what the main story here is the labeling policy greatly impacts consumer demand for GM foods. They tend to push consumers into non-GMO products, a pretty strong externality of these labeling regimes that policymakers adopt. And in our next study, what we look at is from a process standpoint, what could be happening. So we have two conditions here, the voluntary condition, which you see in the top row, and then the mandatory, which you see in the bottom row. And then the main takeaways here are as before, consumers are a heck of a lot more sensitive to GMOs when you show them the yellow mandatory label. And then the impact for that is they're moving away from genetically modified foods to non-GMO foods. And then that's a pretty strong externality. The interesting new finding here is they also become less price sensitive. So not only are they moving away from GM foods, they're also willing to pay more for non-GMO foods. An interesting find there is we do find some evidence here that consumers are actually walking away from a category when they see a ton of GMO labeling. For example, they could be switching the category, like a snacking category, from potato chips to something else. Then in our next study, what we do is actually I'm still on this study. So looking at you can see on the next slide. What we find from a process standpoint is labels actually affect consumer attention. They pay more attention in the mandatory condition. They have more concerns about GMO in the mandatory condition. And finally, they find the task of picking which option do I pick a little more difficult in the mandatory condition. So from a process standpoint too, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on that we were able to uncover. And then in the next study, we kind of build upon this both labels idea. So if you are in the mandatory policy regime, it's entirely plausible that every product that's in the shelves has either a GMO label or a non-GMO label. We call that the both condition, which is sort of the last row here. And all the effects that I talked about, GMO sensitivity, price sensitivity, they're both magnified here. That's sort of the main finding here. And in our last study, what we do is look at policymakers choose a visual, a logo to sort of tell consumers about GMO, right? So we look at two options here. So in the middle row, if you see the shiny, happy green label for GMO, that's sort of signaling a positive GMO signal, right? And then the blue label, which is a bit more staid, it's telling people about GMO without sort of a bit neutral, if you will. And what we find, this is not surprising, what we find is that the GMO sensitivity, the tendency to move to non-GMO products is stronger in the blue GMO label than in the green labels. And that's not a surprising finding. But what's really surprising is what's in the next slide, which there's three groups of people out there, people who actually like GMOs, people who dislike GMOs, then there's a big chunk of people in the middle, 44% in this study, who are what we call GMO indifferent. And for this GMO indifferent segment, what we find is that the blue GMO label is actually moving them towards non-GMO product heck of a lot more than the green label. So this is an important finding for the paper in the sense that the lever the policymakers use, it really tends to shift the preference of people in the middle, and they're not like a small segment. They're 44% in our study. So this is a very pliable segment, and the label really affects their behavior. So in the next slide, we talk about consumer willingness to pay. So in the interest of time, let me just focus on study 4. What we find is depending upon the label. So if it's a voluntary label, people are willing to pay 7 cents more for a non-GMO product. And that number goes up to 9 cents for that green, kind of a very friendly GMO label, if you will, to 18 cents when we have the blue label. So this is indicating that this has economic significance, and the willingness to pay kind of quantifies what I said earlier. So kind of wrap things up, what the main takeaways from our paper are that the choice of labels matters. The mandatory labels are a bit of a stronger hammer, which shifts preferences away towards non-GMO product. Consumer willingness to pay is shifting. People are actually willing to pay more for the non-GMO product. And then the action that policymakers take, the label, Brazil is an example, the yellow label is going to shift the willingness to pay for consumers quite a bit for the non-GMO products. And then the main punchline where I would like to end this is that the GMO labeling not only reduces the demand for GM products, which our studies show, but it's creating big incentives for firms to A, offer more non-GMO products, and B, offer them at a price premium because consumers are willing to pay for them. So fairly complex issue. Let me very quickly thank my co-authors there on the next slide. And this is a fun project, and then I'm glad MSI and GEM think that this is worth a broader conversation. So thank you, Chris. You're in charge.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Raj. That's such an interesting paper. And now we have a really interesting panel to come discuss the implications of this paper. And we have 4 panelists, and I'll just say their names quickly, is Sydney Scott, an assistant professor at the Washington University of St. Louis, and Sabrina Roberts, who's the head of genetically modified and genome editing policy, the Food Standards Agency in the UK. They will be talking about the consumer side of how consumers are going to react to this, and Sabrina on the regulatory side. And then we're going to say, well, if these changes happen and they come down in a certain way, how will the market respond in terms of the sellers? And here we have both academic and industry expertise. Sarah Mashari from University of Chicago is going to talk about what her research shows about changes in labeling regimes and how it changes the supply side. And Mahat Tahiri has extensive experience with food companies, and she's now the CEO of her own consultancy on nutrition sustainability strategies. And she's going to offer her views about how firms are likely to respond and how might they best respond to changes in these regulatory regimes. So we're going to start with Sydney, if we could. And so Sydney, we asked Sydney to speak. She's arguably as expert as anybody in the world about consumers' attitudes towards GM foods. And so I thought I would just start with asking her to, you've just authored this major review of the literature on this. What is the state of public opinion about GMOs? And then what explains the opinions people have?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, John, and to the Marketing Science Institute. As people have said before me in this panel, many people are opposed to genetic modification, and that's especially true when it comes to their food. So we found that in the United States, typically the majority of consumers are opposed to and concerned about GM foods. And this is true even more so in many countries in Europe. And we know a few things about people's attitudes. Our research has shown that a lot of opposition to GMO food is moralized. So for example, we've found that many people say that they would be opposed to GM food no matter the risks and the benefits, which is a way of expressing that they think genetic modification is morally wrong. So as psychologists, we would say that people think tampering with the genome is violating a sort of sacred or protected moral value. Additionally, there are reliable correlates with GM opposition. So people who oppose GM food more strongly Well, they tend to, first of all, unsurprisingly, view it as unsafe and less beneficial. We also find that they view it as grosser, or more technically as more disgusting, and they feel more emotions of disgust. They also, we find, tend to be less knowledgeable about science. So they do worse when we give them sort of true-false literacy tests, scientific literacy tests. And there's a larger gap between how much they think they know and how much they actually know. And finally, extreme opponents tend to have a closer relationship with the natural world. So they tend to feel more connected to nature.
So one of your papers discusses the situation about how people think about products that are chemically or functionally identical, but have been, one has been altered by some human intervention, the other is not. So you've an example in one of your papers of a tomato paste with tomatoes in it is more natural than tomato paste but has sugar added. Then if you have the tomato paste with sugar added, and then you subtract the sugar out, then how do people think about that kind of a product?
Yeah, so I think we've put a lot of effort into trying to understand what people think is natural in general. And one thing that you're getting at is that people will think that that tomato paste, which has had something removed then added or added then removed, is less natural than the original tomato paste. In other words, sometimes the process is more important than the content. So people think that naturalness generally means no human processing and no additives. So humans shouldn't tamper with it, and they especially shouldn't add foreign things to it. And as you say, we also tend to find that even if things are chemically identical, speaking to the importance of processing, that one can be viewed as more unnatural and liked less if it has a different history, if like it was created through engineering or things were added and then removed, even as I said, when those two products are chemically identical. Yeah, so that's some of the research we've done on understanding like what it means to be natural. And then just briefly, that has consequences, unsurprisingly, whether or not something is viewed as natural. So connecting it back to GMOs and genetically modified food, we've found that people generally want natural things. So they believe nature is benevolent and sacred. They think natural things are morally superior, generally safer. Really, with very few exceptions, they think that natural things are better on all dimensions. And so we think this is closely connected to people's views about unnatural genetically modified foods.
Right, that's such interesting research. And so it's really like you say, when it's a moral foundation as opposed to necessarily a safety concern. So it's like a matter of religious belief almost. So it's very interesting to connect that to what's going on in the UK. And our next panelist is Sabrina Roberts, who's the head of genetically modified and genome food editing policy in the UK. And they have a very interesting history. I did a sabbatical in the business school back around when they were changing the laws to require these, to require mandatory labeling. Sabrina, why don't you tell about what the current state of labeling is, and also this distinction that your group is making between genetically modified and gene edited.
Sure. So for labelling requirements in the UK, this applies to GMOs that are used for food use and feed use, and it's required that all labelling be applied, that they have a distinct label to say that they have been produced from genetically modified, and then the name of the variety. So if it's a genetically modified soya, it needs to be labelled as such. So that's our current requirements, and that's been in place for a substantial amount of time, for over 20 years since the regulations were put in place. And one of the interesting things that we looked at last year was to begin to try and understand how consumers felt about GM and GE. So this came about because in the UK, the government is currently kind of looking into exploring new genetic technologies and what this could possibly bring. So we thought it would be an interesting area to explore and understand how consumers felt about these technologies. And one of the things that did arise was that consumers actually tended to find that genome edited food products were more acceptable than GM food products because they perceive them as particularly being more safer and more natural. However, some consumers still naturally didn't align as well with GM, but it was a very interesting study. We also found that consumers also were more acceptable of GM in comparison to GE when it had been applied to animals. So there were some really interesting aspects to the study.
Okay, and so this GE versus GM is a distinction that maybe some on the call might not be familiar with, but as I understand it, GE, if the product could be produced by traditional crossbreeding methods, and your posture is that if it could be produced by a traditional crossbreeding method, why would you treat it differently just because it happens to have been produced by GE? Am I correctly recounting what the issue is there?
Yes, so this is certainly the topic in which we are exploring. So I think we are looking at whether something, if it could have been achieved using traditional breeding methods, should we be regulating it in the same way as we regulate GM technologies? So that is certainly the angle that we are looking at.
And I guess the other thing that's interesting about why you're looking at that is, so the UK has been looking at the scientific consensus and how it's moved. And if you look at how the regulations were put into force at the beginning of this century, I think you said it was around 2002, it was a time that the scientists thought there might be significant risks. And it sounds like your view of the safety risks have declined. So if that's the case, how are you thinking about this now? Like now that you hear of Niraj's results, that these labels actually shift markets, not just help people select what they like. How do you think about those results as a regulator?
So as a regulator, we have to ensure that we look at all available evidence that's available. And I think we definitely take on board the risk assessment, and that is the primary focus for anything being allowed to be placed on the market. In terms of other aspects that we consider as regulators, we also really do consider consumer perceptions, consumer interests, and there are other impacts such as other legitimate factors that we take on board, such as the economic impact. So whilst the risk assessment aspect is the primary concern, there are also other factors that we take into account about how we regulate these products.
So we had a very interesting pre-call about this, and I find this really fascinating. So there's like thousands of things that consumers could care about. And so now, if you see the results that we've led with, so some consumers are not persuaded of this. So the scientists, the regulators, they have one view, but the consumers think something different. What's your view? Is that just simply one of the, I forget the term you use, one of those other relevant attributes, just like anything else? It could be about whether it's made in Germany versus made in France, or whether is something where it's just a matter of if enough people care about a taste attribute, then you will want the government to be involved in labeling it. Is that the way the rule is written?
So not as simple as that, but I think so. Other legitimate factors capture a variety of areas, and consumer interests are definitely considered to be very important. So at the heart of what the FSA does, consumers are at the forefront. So we ensure that food is safe, and how consumers feel about that. So the GM regulations that are currently in place obviously have mandatory labeling to inform consumers. That is not because that implies that there is a safety risk because of those products, but it's providing awareness to consumers about how their food has been derived. So it's around providing information to the consumers, and that's really been a strong request for consumers for a number of years. We do obviously recognise that there are a number of other factors that play into this, and the amount that consumers actually do pay to attention in terms of what's labelled on their food products. So there are also aspects that we do recognise that there can be some flaws. For example, in our study last year, we looked at, we asked participants to explore their cupboards, and it was, some participants were quite surprised about the labelling of their food products, for example. So sometimes branding can play more of an important factor, and consumers will purchase their favourite brands rather than, looking at the ingredients list. So there are a number of factors that do come into play with this.
So one of the things that is quite interesting about these international differences in labeling and then what happens in the markets. So first of all, do you have many GM products on the shelves now that have these mandatory labels in Europe, in UK and Europe? Do you have many GM products that are produced and sold and purchased? And are they made there? Are they imports? What's the effect on the supply, given that you pass this labeling regime that's a mandatory labeling regime, a presence focused in Niraj's terms back in 2002?
Yes, so there are very few GM food products on the market in the UK, and most of these products are actually finished and processed products that are imported from other countries. So these tend to be well-known branded foods, for example, that contain GM. There are some other kind of processed foods available in the UK, such as oil derived from GM crops as well. But there are very few GM foods available in our supermarkets. On a stark contrast, a large percentage of our animal feed sector is reliant on GM feed. So I think that is where the stark difference is in the UK.
Okay, and then I guess the other interesting thing is, do you have many products that are labeled? So Niraj described no labels, only people that say we don't have GMOs, only people who say, only people that are required to say if they do have them, and then both. Do you have firms that are out there in the UK labeling their products as non-GMO?
So I hope you can hear me. I just lost the last bit of your sound there. Great. Okay, so there isn't, the current regulations do not cover labeling of food that is not genetically modified. So we don't have GM-free labeling or non-GM labeling, and these terms don't have any legal definition in the UK. Any food that is to be placed on the market with a GM-free label would need to be subject to the kind of general food law requirements that are outlined in our Food Safety Act. And it's an offence to describe something through labelling or advertising that could be misleading to the consumer about its nature or substance or quality, for example. So GM-free labelling isn't, or non-GM labelling isn't something that we support in the UK.
It's interesting, and so I think just from our previous conversation, part of that is that some products that might call themselves non-GM really do have some traces, but also your concern about it being an implied safety, implied health claim that where there's not scientific substantiation for that superior health claim. Okay, so well, that is really very interesting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the company side.
Thank you, Sabrina. And we're going to turn to Sarah Moshari from the University of Chicago, who has done some interesting research looking at labeling in the Chilean market. So welcome, Sarah. And maybe you could just describe what kind of labeling occurred and what your study found.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So in 2016, Chile implemented a system of nutrition warning labels for food product packages. So the labels essentially indicate if a product is high in either sugar, saturated fat, sodium, or calories. So how this works in practice is the Ministry of Health delineated thresholds. So if a product is above, say, a threshold for sugar, it would have the warning label indicating it's high in sugar. So I worked with Jorge Ale Chile, who's at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, to study the effect that this has on consumers and in particular on firms. So we find that after the labels are implemented, consumers start shifting their purchases to products that are below the thresholds. So we focus on breakfast cereals because that's a category where some of the products are actually high in sugar and high in calories, as defined by the Ministry of Health. But then there are other products that are below the threshold. And so we have, say, imagine a shopping aisle, consumers going to see some products with labels and some without. So consumers start to shift their purchases, and that creates an incentive for firms to reformulate their products. And they do this in a particular way because there's sort of this discontinuity in the incentives. And so you see products being reformulated to sort of just be below the threshold, just to have, just enough of a reduction so they don't have to have a warning label. So we find firms are adapting, and that leads to consumers actually purchasing cereal products that we end up finding that they're lower in calories. So we see a sort of reduction in the calorie content of cereal purchases. And you could certainly imagine something like this happening, say, in response to the GMO labels that have been discussed today.
When you think about that at the market level, what's your sense of how this affected competition or differentiation, prices, some of the things that either directly or indirectly arose in Niraj's presentation?
Yeah, so I think Niraj mentioned that adding these types of labels could increase perceived product differentiation, and that could soften competition between products in a category, giving firms more market power and ultimately leading to higher prices for consumers. So that's definitely one potential effect.
And do you see that? Do you see evidence of concentration or evidence of these other kinds of externalities?
So in the case where we looked at these nutrition warning labels in Chile, we didn't see much movement in prices, at least not over the couple-year period that we were studying. But I wouldn't want to rule them out in another context. I think it's going to depend on the particulars of competition.
John, do you want to ask anything else of Sarah?
I guess, do you see any other, as an economist, do you see any other non-obvious costs of changes in the labeling regime that we should be thinking about in this session?
Yeah, so one question that I've been mulling over is sort of whether these labels will take consumer attention away from other product features, sort of focusing people on this particular attribute, GM or not. My husband has celiac disease, and so I'm accustomed, just as sort of anecdote at the supermarket, to of looking and making sure products that we purchase are gluten-free. And on occasion, I'll notice a product that has a sort of certified gluten-free label, but it's in a category where I would expect sort of none of the products should have gluten in. So for instance, canned beans, and it says gluten-free. And so then I start looking at the other products and thinking, oh, should I be checking? They don't have that label. Does that mean they're not gluten-free? And so now my attention is focused, is what's the gluten content versus, looking at other nutritional information. And so I wonder sort of whether that's going to be a potential unintended consequence of this type of labeling.
That's a super interesting connection, really. And again, Niraj's results about attention. So when you think about it as just information, what you're really saying is you're shifting attention away from one thing that might matter onto something else.
Absolutely.
Well, so you mentioned that your results are specific to that context, and they're such super interesting research. Part of why then now we're going to go to Maha Tahiri is that she has consulted broadly. So thank you, Sarah, so much for your remarks. So Maha Tahiri is the CEO of Nutrition Sustainability Strategies, worked with a wide variety of firms, some of which the big food people that would have the GM products, some of which are competing in the market by the non-GM, et cetera. So I thought I would just ask you to say, like, just from your broad experience, how do you think that firms and food marketers are likely to respond to the change in the labeling going on in the US? They've just gone to this bioengineered, which is like a mandatory labeling regime. How do you predict that firms in the marketplace will respond, and also how should they be responding?
Well, thank you for having me. I think we already have the response because they have responded since the regulation came in, and they do have the intuition of what Sydney has presented at the beginning of this webinar, that consumers really do believe in the natural superiority of natural. And so their first reaction is, I'm afraid of what this could do to my product or with consumers. So that is definitely the first reaction of at least the people who have genetically modified crops or genetically modified ingredients in their products. So the first reaction is that, and that could be actually motivated by a couple of things. First, the thinking of what could be the reaction of consumers, and second, the anticipation of what this labeling could bring with it in terms of policies. Because what the industry could see in any type of labeling, whether it is a nutritional, the change in nutritional labeling or GM, is possibly the beginning of a whole set of policies that would change advertising, limit their ability to market their products, changing advertising, taxation, etc., etc. And so sometimes when you see the reaction of the industry, you see a reaction to maybe not exactly what you're looking at, but a lot more than that. So that's maybe the first initial reaction. I would say then, if you want to go deeper, I think when they think about what their consumer could think, that is not doing the research. Every company should do the research with their consumers to really figure out what will their consumer think about that labeling. Would they notice it? Would it change their behavior, etc.? And they should then make the decision, because you never know what's consumer. I was just yesterday, we were looking at a packaging with one of my startups that I'm working with, and all of us would have ruled out one of the packages. We said, this is the one that we do not like. And that was the only one that the consumer liked. So, yeah. We're never in their shoes. We cannot anticipate their response. And every marketer should just first, before making an opinion about what the consumer would think about GM labeling, just put it on the pack and do the consumer research that is needed so that they can form an informed opinion.
So it sounds like, in your experience, in many cases, the firms are, quote, more worried about it than they, quote, should, because the consumer
Absolutely.
response is slight. Yeah, that is a very, very interesting result. Well, I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we're going to open up to the audience for questions. So people in the audience, if you populate the chat with questions on this. So, you just mentioned that you were working yesterday with a startup. So your experience spans the gamut. And so basically what Niraj's results are showing is that these regulatory changes will shift demand to create some winners and some losers. Mm-hmm. And so if you are on the one side, you're going to have more demand for you, plus ability to charge higher prices, et cetera. How do you see in your consultancy, how do you see these different sectors of the food marketing world navigating this, and also how should they navigate?
Yep. You definitely don't have the same conversation when you're talking to the CEO of Danone or General Mills or a founder of a startup about this topic of GMOs, because a lot of the founders of small companies that are trying to disrupt the food industry are really coming from that type of consumers that believe in natural, that believe in non-GMO, that believe, and so that's their way of more or less disrupting the industry. So you really have the non-GMO consumers have an ally in a lot of the small companies. On the other hand, you could see also in the big companies, there is very much an openness now. All of them are doing non-GMO and GMO products. Yeah. So the choice is there for the consumer, but definitely there is a spectrum of the perception of GMOs and the position of GMOs within the industry, with very much the small companies are more skewed on the world of natural and organic, and therefore non-GMO.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Maha. So I think what we'll do now is have all of those speakers, all 5 of you, go ahead and turn your videos on, and we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. It would be best if you put your questions into the Q&A option on your Zoom bar as opposed to the chat. And then we'll go ahead and if there's a particular person that you would like to address your question to, please go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll just kind of field it out to the group as a whole.
But I'm interested in this. So this issue that Maha was asking about, or talking about the different firms in the marketplace, where they are really trying to promote the non-GMO ideology, and you say even the conventional firms are adapting by offering their array of non-GMO products. I'm interested from Sabrina's standpoint. I asked Sabrina, do you talk with your counterparts in other parts of the world, and how are they thinking about this? So we have research showing that the non-GMO is perceived as a health claim. It's perceived a superior health claim. So how do you navigate that? Are you worried about claims that are implied health claims that are on the non-GMO side, I guess? And then how are people around the world, how are regulators around the world thinking about this issue?
So from our view, we tend to try and look at it from the aspect of, would it be misleading to the consumer? And that's where we kind of draw our attention. So if the labeling could mislead the consumer, confuse the consumer, then that we don't think is suitable. We are kind of looking at this aspect in more detail now that we're looking at the potential of how we could regulate genome edited products. So we've done a lot of kind of digging, initial kind of diving into the issue last year when we did our perceptions of genome editing. And in that, we also kind of tested what consumers would want from labeling. So we presented them with various options, for example, around whether they would want products to be labeled or not. And there was a strong consensus for wanting products to be labeled. But one of the other interesting things we found was that the more participants understood about the technologies, the more receptive they were. So I think that there's still a lot of work that we need to do in this area, particularly in how we take it forward with genome editing. But some of the results are certainly quite interesting already.
It sounds like you're suggesting that there's kind of a consumer education piece that goes together with the consumer labeling piece, and that maybe together they would help undo some of these effects that have been identified, and also lead people to make better choices that suit their own needs without altering the marketplace in the ways that we've observed. There's a first question from Earl asking about, does brand trust mitigate any of these effects? Do people not switch when they already trust the brand? I think the answer is no, but I'll just go. Niraj, I think in your study you used well-known brands, and in Sarah, you studied actual brands in the supermarket. I don't think you guys saw that the brand actually mitigated any of these effects, that it happened for well-known brands and well-trusted brands, and less well-trusted and known brands. Is that right? Niraj?
Yeah, I think in my mind, the non-GMO, for example, as a label, has itself become a brand, right? A pretty powerful one. That you know, just reflecting on my own family, it's like my wife, she doesn't read my papers, so she for her the non-GMO label is a pretty strong brand by itself, and it affects. So whether you're a really well-known brand versus a little brand, it doesn't matter. In fact, for a small brand to use the non-GMO label to come into the marketplace, that may be a way in, right, to enter a very competitive landscape.
I maybe have a parallel with the actual brand. Cheerios is a very trusted brand. And when the gluten-free topic came in, and oats do not have gluten, but the supply chain does contaminate with gluten. And so General Mills had to actually truly invest millions and millions and millions to get gluten out of the supply chain, to keep the trust on their brand, to be able to put gluten-free, and so to keep the credibility and of the brand with something like not gluten-free for Cheerios.
That's what we found also in our research in Chile when they were when we saw this reformulation. We saw some of the leading brands reformulating their product. What was interesting there is we saw some of them kept sort of the original recipe that was high in sugar or high in calories, and they had the label, but then they also created a lower calorie, lower sugar version. So in that case, we saw the options for the consumer expanding.
Yeah.
You know, I want to check. I'm sorry, Maha, please.
It's usually a win for the brand when it makes the effort to do what consumers are interested in.
So I think, like, if you put these different thoughts together, so back to Sabrina's. So in Niraj's results, the most important result from his findings is that the labeling is not informing, it's persuading. It's shifting the market. It's not helping people pick what they like, shifting the market. And it's very interesting that in Sabrina's work, they're looking at education along with this. So if they have this labeling, at the same time, they're talking about what education can avoid people drawing the false inference that there's some safety benefit or a health benefit to the non-GM food. So that issue of education being on the side of not persuading people that it's dangerous, but rather persuading them that it's that the risks aren't there is an interesting angle. Is that, Sabrina, are there any other countries around the world that are doing things like what you're doing?
So I think we're quite new in this space with GE and considering labeling for that. So I think not sure if there's anyone doing anything similar in this space, but we are kind of constantly looking to our kind of international partners in terms of other regulators and understanding how they're potentially regulating and labeling. With regards to, I think, how we look at it, it's definitely an educational piece in how we take some of this work forward, because we do think that you know, at the FSA, our primary concern is ensuring that food is safe for the consumer. So I think as long as that, you know, is there and the food is safe, we don't want to be you know, deterring the consumer from certain products. We just want them to be able to make an informed decision. So we're currently going to just explore how best we can direct the consumer with certain messaging and make them informed enough to make their own decisions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think we'll go ahead, and in the interest of time, I think we'll just go ahead, and I see some other questions. I think we've gotten to a few of them around the education piece related to knowledge and whether consumers will acclimatize to the information. But let me just circle back to all of the panelists now that you've sort of heard everybody, and have you give like maybe a 30-second retrospective view now that you've heard this sort of the whole panel. So Cindy, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Sure. Thanks so much for for coordinating all of this. I think it was really exciting to see some really interesting new research in this area, and also perspectives from both industry and different disciplines in science, and see a lot of convergence in terms of the themes of what's important and how people react, and understanding that consumers are nuanced, that knowledge provision can be complicated and people can infer more than just sort of the literal facts put forth to them. So I'm looking forward to seeing more in this area, and thanks everybody for their thoughtful insights.
Thank you, Sydney. And Sabrina?
Thank you. Likewise, it's been very interesting to really explore the new research out there, and in terms of how we apply this in the UK. I think there's some very interesting aspects that will be useful for us to take forward.
Wonderful. And Sarah? Thank you.
Yeah, this is just a fascinating research, and I enjoyed hearing other perspectives on labeling. I'm also struck by the importance of consumer education in this arena, and I hope to see more work looking at the equilibrium effects of labeling policies to understand how the labels could ultimately affect consumer welfare, including effects on both prices, assortments, et cetera.
Wonderful. Thank you. Maha?
I echo what the panelists said. It's very interesting to hear the perspectives from different views and from the UK. I think we're hearing that the consumers are not as simple as we think when we say, okay, we're going to label something, and that's going to educate them, and they're going to do as we think, and then going to make a choice that we expect them to do. And the gap here is that we need research that is more long-term to see, once people get used to things, do they really change their behavior? When the market is flooded with GMOs in the US, what's going to be the impact? And I'm looking forward to those results.
Thank you, Maha. And Niraj?
It's fascinating to hear what's happening in UK through Sabrina. There are no GM products in the shelves, pretty much is what we heard. And then in the US, it's juxtaposing that. It's interesting to contrast that with the new bioengineered label. Is that the direction we are going in? Are we going to have more high-priced non-GMO products? Are we going to have more GMO products, more non-GMO products? That it's a bit of a worrisome thought for me, because you think about something like golden rice, which was like a poster child for GM products to take care of vitamin A deficiencies in Africa and Asia. There are these substitute risks of this labeling that need to be recognized.
Thank you so much. And let me thank all of the panelists for taking the time, and everyone attending. We had a wonderful turnout. As we can see from this discussion, and I know this is why the Marketing Science Institute is interested in it, is that policy labels are so much more than just information. That they are very powerful in terms of the way that they affect consumer behavior and company behavior, and ultimately, as we can see, potentially the way in which, and in actuality, the way in which markets function, as we see in the UK. So. I'd love for you to take the opportunity to look at the Journal of Marketing paper in more detail. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to follow up with me and John. But again, thanks to John and to everyone at MSI for sponsoring this with us. I did want to, if I can, if I have one more minute, I will actually show you the upcoming webinar. So we have an upcoming webinar on looking at quasi-experiments, which this is the kind of methodology that I've used in my work, that I know Sarah used in hers, where you can't run a field experiment, which often happens with policy. Some markets get it, some products get it, and some don't. And so this is going to be an influential paper, we think, that we're publishing at JM. So we'd love to have everybody come and participate. You can just scan the QR code. This is in May. And then finally, any of the papers that we published are available up on the Journal of Marketing website. We have a range of policy firm consumer behavior papers that I think will be valuable to all of you. So with that, we'll close, and hope to see you in May. Thank you very much, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. We really appreciate it. What an amazing panel. Thank you so much.
Take care,
interesting
everybody.
research.
Appreciate it.